You and I know what happens in a couple of days. We know that this place that now is as desolate as a tomb will, in a couple of days, be filled with flowers, joyful shouts, happiness. But I think it's important for us today that we stay here in this place, in this time, in this moment. One of the people that has become central in a weird way to my understanding of Good Friday is a Welsh priest, theologian, political activist, rabble-rouser, and generally man of wild hair, a priest by the name of R.S. Thomas. And he is one of Wales' most celebrated poets and one of the most influential poets of the second half of the 20th century. In 1967, he won the Queen's Gold Medal for Poetry, and he won the prestigious Royal Society of Literature's Heinemann Award after publishing only his fourth book of poetry. In 1996, he was nominated for the Nobel Prize for Literature, and he lost out to his good friend Seamus Heaney. And after his death, a memorial tribute was held in Westminster Abbey, where Seamus Heaney, his longtime friend, read the eulogy. Throughout his life, Thomas struggled with perhaps one of the most oft-asked, yet never fully answered questions about God. Where is God? Where do we see God at work? Now, Thomas was born in Cardiff in 1913, and he lived to see the dawn of the new millennium. Over the span of his life, he saw tremendous and tumultuous change happening in the world. He saw Welshmen come home as a young boy. He saw them, and those that made it home, wounded with the scars and maimings that were horrific from the Great War, the result of new chemical weapons and devices of killing that previously had not been seen on so grand a scale in the course of human history. He was ordained in the Anglican Church in Wales and was the rector of a small church in the rural northwest part of Wales from 1942 to 1954, where he saw more of his parishioners off to war, this time World War II, and most of those who left never came back home. Thomas realized that since the dawn of creation, mankind has been asking for ways to understand God, our Creator. Theologians are those who study the ways of God, some of whom spend their entire lives in the pursuit of obtaining more knowledge about how God acts and how God operates. And Thomas's poetry is a mix of the Welsh connection to that rugged and beautiful land that is their country, and his questions about God, faith, and the complexities of life run throughout. Thomas found that in his search to know and understand God, it was far easier to see the world and to see the absence of God rather than the presence of God. The apophatic lens through which Thomas viewed the world and the presence of God in that world focuses on speaking about the God who isn't, to show perhaps the God that is. In his poetry, Thomas found God's presence in God's absence. The Most Reverend Rowan Williams, former Archbishop of Canterbury, called this the negative way. You see, God works in the opposite way in which the world works most times. It's like looking at a negative of a black and white piece of film. The opposite of the hues and tones are what are presented. God's ways are sometimes the inverse of how we who are in the world expect them to be. God operates where the lowly are uplifted, you see, where those who are rich will be sent away empty, where an instrument of torture and slow, agonizing death is turned into the vehicle of salvation for all of God's creation. The death of the beloved with whom I am well pleased becomes the gift of everlasting life for us all. In our portion of John's Passion, Jesus should by all means be afraid. He should be desperate. People are coming to kill him. Armed police, soldiers, a mob shows up. And that mob means to harm him, to belittle him, to scare the living daylights out of him. But this is the Son of God we are talking about, who operates differently. Who operates differently than how the world works. So, of course, we see that Jesus is in control of the entire situation from start to finish. We don't get Jesus asking for relief from the situation and mission he knows he must fulfill, as we find in the accounts from John's fellow gospel writers. There is no, if it is your will, take this cup from me. But instead we get, am I not to drink the cup that the Father has given me? In short, Jesus says, I'm ready. Bring it on. He twice reveals himself to the mob that he is I am. The name that was told to Moses from the burning bush. The name of God Almighty. When the mob hears that, they fall on the ground, hiding their faces. For to look upon God was to render one's own life. Jesus, the Son of God, remains in control even during the interrogation at Caiaphas' house. And he remains in control of the conversation, the situation in front of the highest-ranking ruler of the land, causing Pilate to do some very serious thinking indeed. What is truth? He asks. It doesn't get much deeper than that now, does it? God is in control of all that is happening, even if in this section of the Passion there seems to be a whole series of places where Deo in absentia prevails. Jesus is made to suffer after being abandoned by those who call him Rabbi, friend, Lord, and even Messiah. He is beaten, flogged, deserted, and the nails of the Roman soldiers are hammered through that holy flesh, piercing his wrists and his ankles as they are driven into the hard wood of the cross. And Jesus breathes his last. Certainly we are miles and a couple of days away from Christus Rex. On days like today, this Good Friday, perhaps the negative way is most fitting if we are to continue our striving to understand the ways of God. On days when we are confronted with, as the psalmist laments in Psalm 22, my God, why have you forsaken me and are so far from my cry in the words of my distress? I believe that's how R.S. Thomas looked for God, and perhaps is the most appropriate at moments. And isn't the idea about the absent God what most of our lives could very easily focus upon? These Good Friday moments, asking that time-worn and often unanswerable question, where is God? Where was God when? Where was God when the newborn simply stopped breathing and died in her sleep? Where was God when we prayed for months as the cancer that tortured the one we loved eventually wasted his body to nothing and then killed him? Where was God when that first drink after years of sobriety was taken and everything unraveled yet again? Where was God when the young person overdosed with heroin and dies cold and alone? Where was the God when the bombs went off in the Coptic churches this past week, killing over a dozen of his son's devout worshipers on Palm Sunday? Where was God? At moments in our lives, it seems that time itself can be measured in the spaces between catastrophe or calamity, as we feel the very real and near presence of death, and fear that cuts into our normal and changes our lives forever. The disciples felt that fear. They felt that steady pounding of uncertainty, of defenselessness, of terror, and anxiety as Jesus first is taken prisoner. And then word reaches them that their Lord was taken first to Annas, then to Annas' son-in-law Caiaphas, the high priest, the ruling leaders of their own people. Then they felt the fear well up again as Jesus was taken to the Roman rulers to be beaten, scourged, whipped, almost to death with braided cords of leather with shards of bone woven in to induce the maximum amount of carnage with each blow. They were terrified. This was the one upon whom they had pinned all of their hopes and dreams. This was the one that had loved them and showed them a new way of being. This bloody mess wasting away on a cross, slowly suffocating to death with each breath, was the one that had changed their lives and made them feel the very presence of the divine. Where was God then? What was God doing? How could God feel so remote and simply cut off from what was happening to Jesus, to them? Where was God? How could the God they worshipped allow this to happen? R.S. Thomas proclaims the cold reality of this emptiness that is Good Friday, where we feel most starkly the absence of God in his poem Via Negativa. He writes, "Why no? I never thought other than that God is that great absence in our lives, the empty silence within, the place where we go seeking, not in hope to arrive or find. He keeps the interstices of our knowledge, the darkness between stars. His are the echoes we follow, the footprints he has just left. We put our hands in his side, hoping to find it warm. We look at people and places as though he had looked at them too, but miss the reflection." Thomas recognizes right from the very start that he feels no surprise in the fact that we cannot know the ways of God, and that many moments in our lives where we think we comprehend or see, we're just merely hazarding a guess of who God is, where God is, or what God allows to happen in our lives and why. Thomas recognizes the hope, however, that we feel as we try to sort through what has happened, both today, Good Friday, and in the veritable chaos that can be our lives. We have this hope, you see, that we will catch even a glimpse, a vague understanding of the meaning and purpose behind God's actions. The line that sticks out to me is the following: "We put our hands in his side, hoping to feel it warm." When Joseph of Arimathea came to take down the body of Jesus, one can imagine him having that hope. Surely they have not killed. Surely they have not murdered this holy man. Surely God will not allow this to happen to the Son of Man, the Messiah, the chosen one. We put our hands in his side, hoping to feel it warm. Thomas is said to have come upon that image of hoping to find the warm place of where God was when giving a radio interview. He described it that, quote, "Being somewhat of a naturalist myself, I know how I found a hare's form on the hillside, and I'd been able to put my hand in it and still feel it warm. And this is the uneasy feeling of God, that we don't actually find him. We find where he's been. We find the places still warm with his presence, but he is absent. And we find his footprints, but we never actually come upon him, because how can we? If we could comprehend God, we would be God ourselves." End quote. In those moments of chaos, grief, loss, and even suffering in our lives, on those Good Friday moments, we are confronted with the hard truth that we are not God. We cannot rearrange what God has put into order. The old adage remains true. Man plans, God laughs. But even in our Good Friday moments, we can still feel the vague outline of God's presence, like that still warm spot on the cold hillside, left exactly in the shape of the rabbit that has just been there, maybe even been there right in plain sight that we could not see. The evidence of God's presence remains. Seen through that lens, when we read the gospel passage for today, we see that God revealed in Jesus has this. From the start, right up to his last breath, even right now. Today, my prayer for us is that we take a moment, perhaps in the periods of silence that are to come in our service this afternoon, we take a moment and ponder where we have found that warm form left by God. I pray that we are again reminded that at every moment of our life, of every moment that comes to pass, that God is in control of all that is happening, every moment. And that even in the darkest moments of our lives, God is there. Amen.